buddies, for a new review today, we're talking about the upcoming second part of Masters of the Universe Revelation. It's been 4 months now since part 1 debuted on Netflix to quite a divisive reaction. I really wasn't anticipating such a huge backlash to it. But we return now with part 2 debuting November 23rd on Netflix. And let's all hope as big He-Man fans we can all come together and at least somewhat enjoy this part of the story. It's been an interesting 5 to 6 months being a He-Man fan. Part 2 picks up pretty much where we left off, the story of the cliffhanger in part 1, Skeletor now wielding the Sword of Power. So all hands really are on deck here, and every hero of Eternia bands together to fight back the forces of evil in the final battle for Eternia. Now, if I'm being honest with myself, do I really think that people who absolutely hated part 1 are going to give part 2 any sort of chance whatsoever? Not really. I mean, I understand why there was some backlash, because there was even some stuff I had some problems with in part 1 my own self, even if I did enjoy it as a whole. But I do think that part 2 does deserve a second chance if you were skeptical and not a big fan of part 1. As I do think it delivers on things people were upset about in part 1, especially when it comes to He-Man and Skeletor specifically. Their lack of screen time in part 1, I think, was one of the big points of contention for why people hated part 1 so much, and they get a lot more screen time in part 2. Both of them play a much bigger role in part 2 story-wise, and when it comes to the action scenes especially, each of them gets some really big and exciting battles, all of which I found to be very entertaining. I was really surprised at the balance they had between Adam and He-Man in part 2 as well, because both of them get a lot of screen time, and all of it's actually pretty well done. Even adding in some interesting elements for longtime He-Man fans, like what would happen if Adam called for the power and he didn't have the Sword of Power. Some of that stuff you do see in the trailer for part 2, but it gets a lot more crazy than that when you watch the actual episode. One of my favorite elements of this series is the casting of Mark Hamill as Skeletor, and it's even better in part 2 with all that added screen time. He's just the perfect pick for Skeletor. He's entertaining, he's hilarious, he's menacing. Other than, of course, Alan Oppenheimer, I think personally he may be my second favorite Skeletor ever, even if he is putting on this Joker voice for the role. Speaking more on the action, part 2 does put a much heavier emphasis on the action scenes with the groundwork already laid for the story in part 1. It's a very fast-paced show, which I do think works to this series' benefit, because there are hardly any wasted moments among the characters in part 2, since we are kind of short on time with Eternia's fate hanging in the balance every single episode. Even with the fast-paced nature of the show, I do think that part 2 is still able to tell a very compelling story that further develops the plot that was started in part 1, while also still being able to throw in some fun, unexpected curveballs along the way. There are some very unexpected surprises that come along in those last couple episodes. New enemies appear, unexpected alliances are formed, stuff like that, without going into too much detail, but it definitely did shock me, I will say that. Much to many people's chagrin, in part 1 of Masters of the Universe Revelation, we do continue to follow the story of Teela as one of the main characters here, and for the most part I did enjoy her story arc continuation into part 2 and where we leave off at the end of it. Many longtime He-Man fans know by now that Teela is the daughter of the sorceress, and we see that developed even further in part 2, with her trying to harness those powers all throughout part 2, but also attempting at the same time to go against the norm and create her own path. As a whole, it is a compelling storyline, and I think it does have a good message behind it, especially as we lead into the final battle with Teela. I do think it just happens a little bit too fast. I mean, the show is very fast-paced. There's 5 episodes, and they're all like a half hour long, and she goes from kind of knowing about her powers to like fully developing them probably in 5 episodes. It's one of the rare moments in this series where I really think that we could have probably fleshed out that a little bit more to make it be a little bit more believable that she gets all these abilities in such a short period of time. There are also some other characters in the show that I thought was going to get a little bit more screen time and development going from part 1 into part 2, like Andra, and she's kind of gets no development at all. She's still pretty much a background character. She does get some cool upgrades in the season towards the end, but we still really don't know too much about her, so I don't know why she was really included in the first place, along with some other characters that I won't spoil. Other than Teela and of course He-Man and Skeletor, I do think the other big standout in part 2 is Evelyn. We continue her great development from part 1 into this part as well. This is probably one of the best fully fleshed out versions of Evelyn I've seen in any of the Masters of the Universe shows, as we explore a lot of new territory with her as a character in part 2. We even explore her origin story and how her and Skeletor met, and stuff like that. Backstory like that is stuff that I really love as a He-Man and the Masters of the Universe fan. Just exploring her character and all the unexpected twists and turns that we see towards the last couple episodes also is great. The last 2 episodes of this show, going into spoilers of course, it is pure amazing popcorn entertainment for any He-Man fan. Like, if you're a long-term fan of the He-Man series, this stuff is great. Like, even if you completely hated part 1 and completely swore off He-Man, just watch the final 2 episodes of this, because the final war for Eternia is absolutely hype. I haven't said his name yet because I know it is a trigger for a lot of people who especially hated part 1, but Kevin Smith I think did a solid job here. You can definitely tell he sprinkled in some of his humor in the show, some jokes that definitely felt very Kevin Smith-esque in its execution. It's one of those things as a big fan of Kevin Smith's filmography that you kind of just pick up on certain stuff like that. Like, there's one joke in particular that I died at because it had to do with fisting, and I'll just leave it at that. You'll know it when you hear it in the episode. Like, I was on the floor, like, oh my god, we got a fisting joke in Masters of the Universe. And depending on how you feel about the show, whether whether you're happy with it or angry to see it succeed. I will say that it does definitely leave the door open for a potential follow-up series in some shape or form, which I think is going to be pretty cool if we do end up getting that, just with the way that it's set up and who we're going to have it as antagonists. But yeah, all around, I think that part 2 of Masters of the Universe Revelation is a fun, exciting, and engaging second part to this story. I think if you already hated part 1, you're not going to probably like part 2 either, but I would say give it a shot if you did not like part 1, because I do think this part does a much better job as a fan of the series. If you like He-Man, there's a lot more of that stuff that you like in this part. And for the most part, I think it does have a great payoff with all the character arcs we've established throughout all of this series. I don't know if I like part 1 or part 2 more though, because part 2 is a lot heavier on action. Part 1 has a much better of a story, I feel, all around. But I mean, the action in part 2 is pretty great. Part 1 has some pretty great action as well, so it's gonna be tough. I may need to rewatch all of it to just decide if I like that more. I think all around I do like this a little bit more than the other Masters of the Universe show that we got a couple months back. But if you want to check out part 2 of Masters of the Universe Revelation, it'll be hitting Netflix November 23rd. So let me know in the comment section down below what you think of the series when you get a chance to check it out. Did you like the series, not like the series? Where do you think we're going to potentially go in the future for this series as well? Do you think we're going to get another part from Masters of the Universe Revelation with the way that this one ended? Either way, make sure you share your thoughts down below, because part of the fun is having the conversation with you guys in the comments section. But thank you guys so much for my reviews. I really appreciate it. Make sure to like on the video, also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you update my reviews, reactions, unboxings, and more on the channel. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.